it's interesting because since Edge of the Knife, there was such a huge focus around language. But I wouldn't ever say that as a filmmaker I had thought a lot about language. I just tend to gravitate towards historical period pieces or films that are in another realm. And both of those felt really right to be doing in our language and in our Tselkotin language or our traditional language. And same with Edge of the Knife. It was a period piece, mid-1800s. And so it wasn't a question that it would just make sense to be done in the language. So of course, as growing up here in the Chilcotin with a mother who's a linguist, a mother who speaks the language fluently, a mother, and being raised to speak, or with my mother speaking the language with me, I remember a few times seeing, there hasn't been a lot, but there's been a couple times where they've had, like in an art exhibit or a film, they've had some Tselkotin language used. And hearing it, it was like unrecognizable, like something that just, didn't. And so for me, I felt like I just really would like to do justice to the language. And so the reality these days in our communities, people who, depending on what community you're from, but if you're going to have to cast anyone in their 20s, 30s, sometimes 40s, 50s, depending on where you're from, they're not going to be, not all of them will speak the language. And so, how do we get the language to sound true or the best, or honor it in the best way that we can? And so that was something that was important to me, and trying to figure that out. And then as I stumbled along and Edge of Knife really brought this to the forefront for me, being in that community, is how much we had to lean on linguists, how much we had to lean on the community of people who are already doing this work. And then looking at even like, wanting to explore what voice coaching and, how do you emote when you're not saying something you understand. We did rehearsals, and we did a couple weeks of rehearsals, and it was kind of like rapid memorization process. And we did some exercises, and we had maybe, I'm trying to remember how many of the elders, ship elders and people that were involved. I think we had at least, 10 of the language speakers involved in the rehearsal stage, in the rapid memorization. And they, and you have to remember, there's like maybe 25 or so language speakers left. So it was just under half of them were all there, helping actors rapid memorize. And I remember just when we first started, it was like you could tell that the actors were weighted heavy, of worry, of fear, of how much memorizing they had to do, of just the task at hand. Like, I think they were quite overwhelmed and nervous. And then you could feel it also with the language teachers, who felt really weighted and really heavy with like, how are we going to do this, and how are we going to, get this sound. But I don't remember how many days in. We were all at longhouses together. We're all eating together. We're all, it's like so we're having moments of beauty, of singing and dancing and hanging out in the evenings. But there was a moment where we tried different exercises where we, made people put their books away, and they had been doing this for quite a few days now. And I said, okay, let's do an exercise with a scene and bringing the emotion into it. Because when you're in that state where you're just trying to memorize, and they're not, a lot of them hadn't had done acting prior to it, and so you're just so pressured in trying to remember a line, and then remember a line not in a language you speak. getting them to now express it with anger or with flirtation or with, what, that was the moment. It was just seeing all of a sudden this language coming alive, and seeing the the elders in the room witnessing and watching now. I remember the first practice when we did was with, maybe a few teenagers and a couple younger children, and before you knew it, people who didn't even have to feed them lines, they were just taking over. They were all of a sudden, they knew their lines, they were emoting, expressing. And so seeing that, and it just lifted the whole room. It lifted the whole rest of the time we were there. Everyone was bubbling with excitement. All of a sudden, I felt like I was doing something more than just telling a story. It was the first time that I've always been hard on myself and tried to I've tried to push myself as though, using film or using documentary, using those things as a catalyst for change in our communities. I approached film that way. And so it was really hard on myself to always be doing something worthwhile. And I slowly started to find joy in actually just, doing a sci-fi, like The Cave. Like all of a sudden there was just in telling our story, and the joy that came around that I started to be freer and be able to say, okay, I don't have to, be making these massive changes in our communities. But at the same time, when working on Edge of the Knife and feeling all this community that were around and supporting, and feeling them all buoyed by the process of it, by, imagine people working in language their whole life, like working hard to try to have it come to life again, and then they're along in this creative process and seeing young children and seeing other people, all expressing in the language, and they're a part of that. So just feeling all of that energy really, really struck me, and it felt like, oh my God, I'm doing something more than just telling a story. And that's really stuck with me and made me love film even more, and is now influencing. I've always was going to tell period pieces that had to include our history and our language, but now it's making me think a lot more about process, think a lot more about, okay, how do we incorporate this pre-production? How do we incorporate language? And beyond language, also when you're doing historical period pieces, the whole art department opens up a whole realm of cultural regeneration and art regeneration within our communities. The experience that I had with Edge of the Knife, and just it was a pretty amazing process, because with the producers that we had involved, Asuma, who are very community and Indigenous, like sort of filmmaking practice. We didn't have to fight for anything. It was very much like, we really want to take this amount of time. We want to focus this amount of time. We want to do this workshop or that. They were very much behind that. But with that said, the budget was the budget. And so taking that experience and thinking about it now as I move forward into my next feature in my territory on Artsakot in War, which was in 1864, I've wanted to nourish that even more. Imagine the people who sew in our communities or are interested in fashion, or weavers, that are in the community. A lot of them probably haven't woven what the 1860s weaving looked like, or, some of them may do hides, but they've never done the goat hide for a particular armor that was used in 1860s, and haven't used all the dentalium, like I'm speaking specifically of that Tsakhkotin, like use the certain dentalium like wigs that we've so it's a time for artists or different Tsakhkotin artisans or artists that to be able to experiment and explore some of their own traditional art stuff. And so I'd love to be able to just hand money in the preliminary stages to different people in our community. So you could have people who are interested in tattoos, people who are interested in makeup, hairstyling, people who are carpenters, people who are into props or making, there's a young man who's a jiu-jitsu person in the territory who, really wants to study what our old Saltkod combat was, so it's like, how do we give people ample time to further this research and experiment and explore it all as separate artists, so that they get to then become the experts in these art department areas, so that when we do have the film pre-production beginning, we can pair these Saltkod artists, experts, with these art department heads who then get to share and collaborate together. One producer I know, a friend of mine, Tyler Hagen, he always talks about, he says, a film budget's a film budget, but we only create these sense of rules. Like, if you say, no, we need to do this, then that's what the budget becomes, right? That's what it looks like. With that said, I still think that there are, one, I do avoid in this preliminary state, I do avoid film finances or film money, because of those particular, I feel like it's going to throw me into kind of more of a fast track, wants to quicken everything. So lately, while we're in this research phase, I've been looking a lot more at like art funding and at cultural and language funding. But there also lies a tension. I think that there have to be, really careful not to go and take all the cultural and language funding from my area here for this work, because there are so many language people and so many cultural people who this is their life, this is what they do. So I'd much prefer not to be taking those pots of funding that are there allocated for that. So yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, this is a different form of process in a different way. And so in some ways, I'm just trying to gather partners and people who we can discuss, how do we fund something that looks like this, where, our pre-production will take 5-6 years, yeah. So, I mean, there was lots of learning ground that happened, but it was great because I co-collaborated. I co-directed with SGaawaay, who was one of the co-writers on the script. So he really got to share with me a lot of some of the things that he was learning, wishing to do in a different way or that. So that really has helped influence me in thinking about the process for the next script that I want to work on. And so one of the things that he talked about was, how do you write the script in a way where, if you're going to write it in English and pass it off to be translated, he really felt like it's smart to do it in a very simple way, not like trying to be poetic in English, because you're going to get Haidas to translate English poetry as opposed to bring their own creative energy of their own Haida poetry, And so those are, that was like really, really interesting for me. And I know, so now it's like, okay, well, with the script I want to do, I'm thinking, okay, well, for this Saltkod War project is how to do a script just by action. What are the beats, what happens in each scene, and then work with a team of language speakers who are storytellers to come up with a dialogue, so that the dialogue is written first in the language. I think there's just so much joy in that. Like, I get joy from that. I get really excited about that. I think that there's, ample opportunity through the film process that can really, for me, gets me excited about working within my community. Whether we're choosing to do it in a language or whether we're choosing to use community regeneration or cultural regeneration or language regeneration, what it does is it slows things down. And if we want to do things well in that way, how do we allow that time and space? How do we financially find that support and a team that is willing to take that time? I think that's one of the biggest things for me is, this allowing space and time, fighting for space and time, finding the money for space and time, and valuing doing it that way because of the richness that it brings to the story, the richness it brings to our community, and it's fun.